Welcome to Face the State. I'm Arianna Bennett. Thank you for joining us. Well, depending on who you listen to, what's happening in our economy right now is either an enormous travesty headed toward disaster or a necessary rough patch before a period of growth. So how should we frame this current moment of tariffs, inflation, stock market volatility? Dr. Elliott Parker, a professor of economics at the University of Nevada, is here with me to talk about that. Thank you so much for coming back on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Always great to have you. All right. How would you describe the state of our economy right now?
Very uncertain. I feel like we're unnecessarily taking an economy that was really one of the envy of the world in terms of how fast we were growing, and we're introducing a lot of instability into it that I think is going to make at least the next year harder.
Are you referring specifically to the tariffs?
The tariffs are primarily what I'm focusing on. That is the fact that they're on again, off again, changing. There's a question of whether they might be negotiated back down, et cetera. Leads to a lot of uncertainty. Businesses, whatever your opinion on tariffs might be, and my opinion is maybe a little nuanced, businesses don't like to make huge investments when they don't know what the future is going to bring, right? So do you make a trade deal? Well, no. Do you invest in producing something here? Well, no, because 6 months from now, the tariff may not be there, right? It may be something completely different. We've seen them go on again, off again. And that uncertainty is making a lot of investors nervous. And that uncertainty then is one reason why economists in general, we think in terms of probabilities. There's a million things happening. But economists in general are leaning now toward a majority opinion that a recession over the next year is likely. How deep it would be, we don't know. Likely not to be too deep, but it depends on what happens to policy over the next 6 months or so. And I have a hard time predicting that, and unpredictability is one of the reasons why we can drive ourselves into an unnecessary recession.
And that's the tricky thing about it is so much of the economy, the health of the economy comes from consumer confidence.
Absolutely.
Right? And so if the confidence is shaken, people aren't spending, and then things grind to a halt faster than they would otherwise.
Right. Economics has a lot of self-fulfilling prophecies in it, right? I mean, if we all wake up tomorrow and we decide there's going to be a recession, we'll all take steps to protect ourselves from that. We'll stop buying things, right? We'll be careful about what new jobs we take. And if employers do the same thing, they're not going to hire, they're not going to invest. And those things can create a recession. And so trying to create, manage investor confidence, to have a steady hand at the helm, I think is one thing that we want in policy.
Yeah, makes sense. I want to take a step back a little bit and talk about tariffs on a basic level. We hear the term thrown around a lot. Unless you are an economist or an international trade expert, as you happen to be, there might be some misunderstanding about how they work and what exactly they are. So what's kind of the elevator explanation of what a tariff is?
A tariff is a tax. It's a fancy word for a tax on imported goods. And basically, when goods come from overseas and they get unloaded in the port, they're more or less said, okay, here's your bill of lading, here's the value of things, here's the items in it. Now it's not done by the customs inspector there, it's done by an agent who will work for the Customs and Border Patrol folks. And then say, basically, here's your bill, and you'll have to pay tax on everything that comes in. Now, that in the short run gets passed on to consumers, right? Because the business who pays it can't necessarily, they can't necessarily eat that cost. So they're going to pass it on to consumers. Now, a big economy like the United States, we will have an effect on the rest of the world. If we stop buying, and so the entire purpose of the tariff is to make imported goods more expensive. And by making it more expensive, we buy less. If we buy less from the rest of the world, we can drive the price down a little bit in the rest of the world. This is, I think, what President Trump was talking about when he said that, other countries would be paying for the tariffs. Now, as a rule of thumb, based on the size of the U.S. economy and the size of the rest of the world, I would estimate that for every $3 to $4 that American consumers pay in higher prices, foreign exporters will probably pay, that is, give up about $1, right? So we'll pay most, they'll pay a little. And now, what then effect does that have? Well, in the short run, of course, consumers will pay more. You're going to have a lot of firms that have imported parts. You know, in the modern economy, goods cross borders many, many times, right? And taking, I have an iPhone in my pocket somewhere. If you take that iPhone out, it's made up of components that come from dozens of different countries. And those components will be shipped over and then shipped back and shipped over. And we do that because tariffs have been really low in the post-war period. It's part of the system that the United States created, what became the World Trade Organization. And we created a system based on relatively free trade, that is very low tariffs. Not everybody follows it, but we created that system on purpose. And it's encouraged firms over time to set up very complex supply chains to make more money that way. And the problem is you add those tariffs all the time, all of a sudden the whole thing breaks down. Right, those goods are not going to be coming across. Simple goods, yes, they may come and have this tariff, but other things, it's going to become kind of a mess. Do you remember in the pandemic, in the post-pandemic era, when you couldn't get goods, right? That was because we had difficulties with container ships, right? We didn't have enough containers available. We didn't have enough truckers available, right? It was very difficult to get goods to market. So the worry is that doing it suddenly could make that disruption happen again.
And when you say suddenly in terms of the economy, we don't mean overnight. We mean 6 months from now?
Well, okay, what does suddenly mean? There's the announcing of the policy.
Oh, right.
Right, which happened relatively quickly, right? Normally, tariffs are under, by the Constitution, they're under control of Congress. And generally, when we negotiate trade deals, we spend years negotiating those trade deals. And then we come out with a trade agreement, then we bring it to Congress. Congress votes it up or down based on what they call fast track authority. That is, they can't nitpick it, they have to accept it or reject it. So it's under control of Congress. The president only has the power to do anything about tariffs because Congress has granted that to him in case of national emergencies. And he's argued this is a national emergency. And I think it's not what the people who wrote that law were intending. They were thinking like a military attack or something.
Right, because the last time we saw sweeping tariffs like this, it was an act of Congress, correct, in 1930?
Yes, exactly. The Smoot-Hawley tariffs in 1930 was the last time we made a significant increase in tariffs of this magnitude. In fact, this is much higher than what Smoot-Hawley did. Right, the amount of tariffs we're talking about are far beyond what happened back in 1930.
For those who are not historians,
what
what happened?
Okay, so 1929, we're going into a recession. Financial markets have crashed, stock markets have gone down. Congress had the bright idea, especially two congressmen, one named spelled Smoot, and another fellow named Hawley. And so they thought, well, okay, if we could just buy American goods, we could get out of this recession so much faster. And so they started debating it in, I think, fall of 1929. Right, so you remember the stock market crash happened in October 1929. It finally passed in May of 1930, which is exactly, well, more or less, 95 years ago. And over the next year, they phased in significant increases in tariffs. Now, not as significant as what has been put on the table, what we're seeing, but really significant shock at the time. And instead of helping our economy recover by getting American firms to produce it, what happened is, yes, imports fell and we stopped buying imports, but exports also fell by more. So we stopped producing the goods that we used to trade with other countries. And this helped to make the Great Depression really great, right? it was a bad recession. It was going to be a bad recession, but this made it worse. And all over the world, trade slowed down. And the world, we helped to take what could have been a U.S. recession, right, and made it a worldwide depression through this policy. And it's one of the things that some people argue led to the rise of Nazi Germany. So by 1932, you know, the economies were doing so bad, Germany was so hard hit at that time that the Nazis were able to get power because people were voting for something, because Germany had been through a very tough, you know, dozen years or so after World War I.
They're voting for change.
So that's the last time we tried something like this. But even that was debated over 6 to 9 months and then implemented under law. And you knew what the law was. It wasn't one man's opinion, right? It was a law passed by Congress. You knew what it was and you could make decisions in that case. Now, Roosevelt decided that that whole strategy was a bad strategy. And he had a Secretary of State, his name was Cordell Hull. And Cordell Hull believed that countries were much less likely to go to war with each other if they traded with each other. And that was what essentially the linchpin of U.S. policy in the post-war period. This idea that if we can get countries to trade with each other, then there'll be less fighting. Now, we still have wars in small countries, generally, you know, Afghanistan and Iraq and Sudan. But Germany and France and England have not gone to war with each other, right, in 70, 80 years. And the whole purpose of U.S. policy was to create that environment. And now we're basically throwing all that away, right? And we're throwing U.S. policy basically ever since, you know, under every president since Roosevelt, we're throwing it out the window.
Is there a scenario in which this future that the Trump administration is predicting, they're saying this is a rough patch that we have to go through before we're going to have this economic boom? Is there a scenario in which that happens?
So tariffs are not always a policy you want to avoid. They might be useful. So, do you garden?
Not well.
Okay, well, imagine you've decided you want to prune, say, your apple tree, or you want to prune your roses. Now, you don't have time because you're really busy, so you hire somebody. And one guy shows up and he's got glasses and he has a pair of clippers in his hands and he plans to take some time. And he's going to go in and trim the dead parts away and try to make it so other parts can grow. And you might say, well, that might work, right? Maybe it works. And I'll get away from the metaphor in a minute and come back to what research says. Now you got another guy, he comes in with a chainsaw. And he says, I'll prune your roses. Now who are you going to hire? Right? Yes, it may be true that if you cut the roses off at the base that they may grow back into something better. Right? But you'd like the person who's doing the trimming to use a little care, to know what he or she is trimming and not just go after everything. This idea actually goes back to the first Treasury Secretary, a guy you might have heard of named Alexander Hamilton, right? So what is Hamilton arguing? He argues at one point that yes, having government interventions can help certain industries. Now he was encouraging subsidies, but Congress wound up passing his tariffs. But how high were his tariff increases? He was proposing going from basically 5% to 10%. Now, these tariffs have a minimum of 10%, and in China they go as high as 145%. Now, Hamilton's argument was called infant industry, this idea that there are some industries that if you can protect them, right, with a pair of clippers, not a chainsaw, if you can provide them some room to grow, right, that we could develop skills in this area. We could get better at producing certain things. So it's not like that idea is completely foreign, but you don't do it with across-the-board tariffs. You do it with surgical tariffs. You do it by identifying which branches are the strong ones and which things you want to invest in and which things that we could get better at.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does. That was a great metaphor. Thank you. That is a great opportunity for us to take a quick break, but sit tight, because coming up on Face the State, I will be back with Dr. Elliott Parker to talk about what to expect out of this economic moment, maybe what decisions we can make to protect our assets after the break.